three-part series with the overarching theme.
I'm lost.
I know. Well, not really, because to sum up, the overarching theme is called to be healers. And first week, I talked about how we need to learn to accept God's healing for ourselves. And then last week, I talked about how we need to extend that out and how that we can be healers for one another within a fellowship setting, such as we have right here. And this week, I'm going to talk about how we can, this is sort of a concentric thing, like circles, how we can take it out farther, and how we, both individually and we as a fellowship, can be agents of healing in the community, which this community, like every community really, is in need of healing. And I wanted to start off by giving us a good example for this, a story that we're all familiar with, the story of the Good Samaritan. And I thought about just alluding to it since we are all familiar with it. But it's not that long a passage. And there's a few things in it that I particularly want to draw attention to. So I'm going to read a few verses here from Luke chapter 10. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this, and you will live." But he, that is the man who's questioning Jesus, he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So when he says that he wanted to justify himself, there's probably a couple of different ways we could look at that. He wanted to make himself seem just or righteous. Or maybe in the English sense of justifying yourself, maybe he wanted to justify some behavior of his. But I don't think he got the answer he was expecting. In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite," which is a member of the priestly class, "when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' 'Which of these 3,' Jesus asked the man, 'do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?' The expert in the law replied, 'The one who had mercy on him.' And Jesus told him, 'Go and do likewise.'" So this is a story that even people who aren't necessarily church-going people or Christians or believers are often familiar with, because the very terminology of the Good Samaritan, and the term Good Samaritan doesn't appear in here, just Samaritan, but that very terminology has become part of our vocabulary, right? We think of, when we hear the term be a Samaritan, we think of the story of this nice person, right? That means be a good person. But it's important to have some inkling of just what a Samaritan was and why Jesus used a Samaritan in this story. Now, there's a couple of instances in the New Testament of Jesus interacting with Samaritans. Samaritans were people who lived nearby and lived among the Jews, who had some common cultural things. And actually the Samaritans themselves and the Jews had slightly differing interpretations of where they came from. Probably it was a mixture of the two. Basically, if you remember in the Bible, King David and Solomon his son. They were kings over all of Israel. But after that period, the northern part of the kingdom broke away, so that there was then Israel and Judah to the south. And the capital of Israel, the northern part, was Samaria. And around the 8th century BC, the Assyrians came through and conquered Samaria and those northern tribes, that northern kingdom, and took many of the people away as captives. Some people escaped being imprisoned and being taken away, and the Samaritans claimed that they were descended from those people, that remnant that was left behind in Israel. Some Jews believed rather that they were people from neighboring areas who just came in once the area was empty and took up residence with it. So when the Jews were later taken away by the Babylonians and returned, they found that they had these neighbors now who had some cultural similarities to them, and in some ways were keepers of the law and worshiped the same God, but it was kind of mixed in with the cultures and religions of some of the other areas. So they were considered impure. And actually, the Jews, particularly at the time here in the 1st century, would have regarded the Samaritans with disdain. They did not like them at all. They considered them to be people who had come in and taken part of the land that they weren't entitled to. Maybe they considered them wannabes. It would be like, in this story, if the story were set in modern-day Israel, it would be like a man being beaten and robbed, and the rabbis all passing by and leaving him there, and a Palestinian merchant, maybe a Palestinian businessman, being the person who came and helped him and took care of him. And when we put it in that framework, and we think of it that way, we can see how shocking an idea this kind of was, because those were people who would have considered one another enemies, even. Would not have been well disposed toward one another at all. When you think of your neighbor, we tend to think of people who are like us, people who think like us or believe like us. But in this case, the person who was behaving as a neighbor toward this man who had been robbed wasn't someone of his own faith or his own culture at all. It was someone from one that was socio-politically opposed to them. And yet, he treated this man with mercy. And Jesus was saying, that's what you have to go out and do. And he's not just offering that as a suggestion, as, wouldn't the world be nice if you did such and such? He was tying this in to the answer to the man's question, what do I have to do to live forever? And Jesus said, this is one of the things you have to do. You have to love God and you have to love your neighbor. And loving your neighbor means being like this Samaritan man. So an interesting thing that I thought was worth pointing out, and what the Samaritan man actually did, was he saw this Jewish man that had been beaten and left for dead, and he felt pity for him. So that was the first step. He felt sorry for him. He felt pity for him. But then, you'll notice, he took action. And maybe the priest or the Levite that were walking by felt some degree of pity, but their big concern was, let me get over to the other side of the street just in case there's any trouble I don't want to get involved with. But this man took action. He took action actually using his own time and then using his own money. If we're looking at this in conjunction with our overall theme of healing, he actually engaged in physical, literal healing work of this individual. He bandaged up his wounds and took care of it. So that's not something that would have been, a few seconds. And then, once he had done that, he took him to the inn and used his own money to pay for the guy's upkeep. So he was using his time, he was using his money, he was healing him in a physical way. But when you take into account all those other factors, those social factors, you have to think that just his actions, even divorced from any connection to faith or God, still were more than just physical. That the person who would receive this kind of ministering, this kind of serving, would have felt that it was more than just physical aid that he had received. And that sort of reminds me of something that we've talked about each of the last 2 weeks that I started off describing a lot in the first one, and that is the balm of Gilead, of biblical term, it's a biblical medication, it's like a salve.